Welcome once again to our discussion on principles of economics. In our last session, we were talking about game theory and oligopoly market, right? Now, so far, whatever principles we have discussed, all those principles, they are known as microeconomic principles because they deal with decision making at the micro level. Now, if you recall, in one of our very first lectures, we said that these principles are divided into two subcategories. One group is known as microeconomic principle, where decision making happens at the micro level, and another set of principles are known as macroeconomic principles, wherein we are interested to learn how the economy as a whole works, right. So, that is why the distinction between micro and macro economics, right. So, micro studies individual households or firms decision making, whereas macroeconomics is basically the study of the economy as a whole. And we begin our study of macroeconomics by discussing countries' total income, basically to understand the measurement, how to measure a nation's income. When I talk about income, first of all, why should we be interested to learn and understand measurement of nation's income? Basically, the idea is, if you recall, in one of our previous sessions, we said that an individual's well-being in terms of what should the individual consume, what should be the individual, where should the individual stay, what type of car the individual should use, so on and so forth. All these things are decided by the individual's income. So, an individual's well-being depends on individual income. If we apply the same analogy in the context of a nation or a country's well-being, that means the well-being of all the citizens living in that country depends on the country's income. That is why we are interested to know that how to measure a nation's income. Okay. Nation's income is basically measured by the gross domestic product. This is a term which you might have heard many times in newspapers, in TV channels, or in many other places. So, GDP is basically a measure of country's total income. That means, this is the income of everyone in that country, and GDP also measures total expenditure on country's goods and services, right. So, there are two ways by which we can measure, by income method and by expenditure method. So, for the economy as a whole, then income equals expenditure, because every rupee what is spent, what the buyers are spending, or every dollar what the buyers are spending, that same dollar or same rupee is basically the income of the seller. So, buyer's expenditure is the seller's income. In that sense, when we are considering the economy as a whole, income equals expenditure. That is the idea. Okay. Now, this circular flow diagram once again will help us understand how the macroeconomy works, and the same circular flow diagram we have discussed in the beginning to start with, when we are discussing about how the economists they use simple models to understand the complex reality, right. So, this simple model illustrates GDP as spending, revenue, factor payments and income. So, factors of production are inputs like labor, land, capital and other natural resources, and then we have factor payments like wages and rent. Okay. And this is the circular flow diagram. Okay. So, we have farm sector, and then we have household sector, and then households own the factors of production, and the firms they hire factors of production from the household sector, and we have two markets, one is called input market and another one is called output market. Okay. So, this is markets for factors of production, we call it input market, and then we have this is in this factor markets, who is the buyer? Firms are actually buyer. So, that is why factors of production it is going to the farm sector, households are seller, they are selling land, labor and capital. Okay. And in return they are earning income from the farm sector in the form of wages, rent and profit, these are all included in GDP, and then that becomes income. What is expenditure for farm? That is basically income for the household, and that is again the part of household income, and that again part of country's GDP. And in the markets for goods and services, households are spending, and that is again part of GDP, and that is the revenue coming for the firms, and that is again the part of GDP. So, this circular flow diagram explains easily the concept of GDP, income and expenditure. Somebody's expenditure is the income for the other economic agents, that is what we are talking about here. Okay. So, goods and services sold in the farm sector, and then goods and services are bought by the households, and then this is what is a circular flow. But the diagram, the circular flow diagram, it omits certain important things. What are those? Look at this. The government collect tax, buys goods and services. So, government expenditure and tax is not shown here. Okay. The moment the individuals earn or the firms earn income, there is a tax involved in that, okay, and that tax is actually the income of the government, and government spends that income to buy goods and services. And we are not mentioning any financial system also, because if you look at we are saying that households are selling labor, land and capital. Now, it is not that households are directly selling capital to the firms, they are actually saving their money to financial intermediaries like bank, and these firms they go to the bank and then they borrow money. So, household saving goes to the firms through this financial institution, financial intermediaries, that is not shown here in this simple diagram. Okay. So, foreign sector also, like trades in goods and services, financial assets, those things are also not included in this simple diagram. Now, what is gross domestic product then? Look at the definition carefully. The market value of all final goods and services produced within the country in a given period of time. Now, each and every word and phrase of this definition is important. So, we will try to understand the meaning of each and every phrases of this particular definition. First of all, market value, look at this. So, that means goods are valued at their market prices. So, we are talking about only marketable goods and services in the GDP. GDP includes only marketable goods and services, and that is why all goods and services they are measured in same unit, either in dollar or in rupee in the context of India. So, therefore, the goods which are not traded in the market, those things are not included in GDP. That is also we have to keep in mind. Things that do not have a market value, those things are excluded. For example, in our households, we all receive tremendous care from our parents. We also get foods produced by our mothers or our spouses. But those things, since they are not traded in the market, are excluded from GDP, even though they have tremendous value in our life. We have to keep in mind. So, that is why market value is very important in the definition of GDP, right. And then we are talking about only final goods and services intended for end user, okay. Only final goods and services, no intermediate goods, okay. So, intermediate goods which are used as components or ingredients in the process, they are not included in the GDP, okay. Now, it may so happen that for somebody intermediate good is the final good. So, that would be included in that person's income, right. So, in a supply chain, that is why everybody is including their only final product, right. So, GDP only includes final goods, they already embody the value of intermediate goods used in their production, right. So, that is why only final goods. How much value it is adding, that is what is called gross value added, and that is why GDP includes only final goods. And then GDP includes tangible goods like pen drive, DVDs, mountain bikes, beer, shirts, so on and so forth, and also services like dry cleaning, concert, cell phone service, haircut. So, everything, it is not only about goods, but also services, okay. And then GDP includes only currently produced GDP includes only the currently produced goods, not the previous one. So, GDP include produced goods not produced in the past, okay, because we are only talking about the current period's income. Goods which are produced in the past might have already there in that year's, in that time period's GDP. So, that is why when you are talking about GDP for India, let us say in the year 2023, then we are talking about the goods which are produced in that particular financial year. And then within a country, this is very important. So, what I am saying that GDP measures the value of goods and services produced within a domestic territory, let us say India. Now, it may so happen that within the India's political boundary, there are many foreign firms, there are many foreigners who are also producing something. Now, those things are also included in India's GDP. So, in that sense, GDP is a very crude measure, because it talks only about goods and services produced within the domestic territory in a given period of time, not necessarily only by Indians. So, that is why there are other measures suggested by economists to reflect how much of that income is produced by Indian citizens, and those are measured by, let us say, GNP, gross national product. So, that means unlike GDP, GNP measures the income of the Indians which are happening within Indian territory and also from abroad. So, that means we can get GNP from GDP if we subtract foreigner income from GDP, and then if we add Indians who are earning from abroad. And we are talking about the goods and services produced within the country in a given period of time, right, usually in a year or quarter of time, maybe 3 months, quarter of a year. Okay. So, then this makes the complete definition of GDP, right. So, that means what we are saying is that GDP measures only the final goods and services, and it measures only the market value, and it is produced within the domestic territory irrespective of whether it is Indians or foreigners. It captures both the marketable market price of both goods and services and within a given time period. So, that is the complete definition of GDP we are talking about. Then what are the components of GDP? So, GDP is basically the total spending, and these are the components. There are 4 components. One is the consumption, that means the household consumption we are talking about. Investment is the private investment, for example, when the firms are making the investment. So, that is what is called investment expenditure. And then government purchases, okay, government spending on infrastructure, so on and so forth, and net export, which is export minus import. So, that means if you look at this equation where Y is basically the GDP equals to C is consumption, I is investment, and G is the government spending plus net export. Now, why is this net export? Export minus import, because when we are exporting, basically we are spending on foreigners are actually spending on Indian goods and services, and import is basically a part of income generated from C plus I plus G on the goods produced abroad. So, that is why the net spending, basically net export is net spending, okay. Export minus import, that is also included in the GDP. Okay. So, there are 4 components, C plus I plus G plus net export. Now, the moment I include net export, it is assumed the economy is an open economy. So, if the economy is closed, if there is no trade happening with outsiders, with other countries, then Y is measured only by C plus I plus G. So, that is country's income, and then a portion of income generated from C, I and G will be spent on the imported goods, and at the same time the foreigners will also spend on Indian goods when we export. That is why that net export is also included in this GDP calculation or calculation of a nation's income. Now, what is consumption basically? Look at this, is the total spending by households on goods and services, right. Now, what about housing? When we spend on housing, is it a consumption or expenditure or investment? Look at this, what is happening. So, suppose you are taking a house for rent, then the consumption includes the rent payment. Why this is so? Because when you are renting a house, basically a house will give you certain services. You can stay there. So, that is some kind of service you are getting from that house when you rent it. So, in that sense, by paying a rent, you are actually consuming that services from that particular apartment. That is why consumption includes the rent also. What about when you are staying in your own house? That is called computed rent, that is also included. Okay? So, consumption includes the imputed rental value of the house. Okay? But if you purchase a new house, then is it a consumption? No. When you are purchasing a new house, that is actually an investment, because that will generate, a new house will generate a flow of future income. Whether I give it to someone for staying, then I will earn. Even if I stay in my own house, I am indirectly earning that rent. Okay. So, as if I am taking the house for rent from myself. So, at the one hand I am the landlord, at the other hand I am the tenant. Okay. So, that means purchase of house, it influences the two components of GDP, both investment and consumption. When I am purchasing a new house, that value is straight away going to the investment. Then every successive periods when I am getting rent from others, or when I am staying it, those things will be, those rents will be included in the consumption. Okay. What about investment? So, investment is the total spending on goods that will be used in the future to produce more goods. That way I told, I said, what I mentioned, that when I spend for a new house, that is called a capital investment, because that will produce future services, that will generate future income, right. So, includes spending on, look at this, capital equipment. So, machines and tools, and new house is also considered as a capital, because that will generate future income. Then we have structures like factories, office building and houses. Okay. So, everything is going into investment. Then house is included in structure, and then inventories. If goods are produced in previous periods but not sold, that will be counted as this period's investment. Now, one thing you have to keep in mind, investment does not mean purchase of financial assets like stocks and bonds. Even though casually we say that I made some investment in share market, I made some investment by buying some stocks or bonds, interestingly that is not included in investment. Can you think of what would be the reason? Why investment, what we generally think that purchase of stocks or bonds are investment, but economists are saying that that investment is not the investment we are talking about. This is not included in GDP. Okay. Why this is so? The reason is here, when we talk about investment, that is basically the private firm's investment. Suppose I am investing 100 rupees on a particular firm's stock. That 100 rupees the firm will use to buy, let us say, one machine. So, that means the firm will show that 100 rupees spending on a capital or a machine as the investment, firm's investment. Now, if I include my spending on that firm's stock also as investment, then there would be a problem of double counting. That is why household spending on stocks or bonds, they are not included in investment, because that is included in private firms investment figure. Okay. So, this is one thing we have to keep in mind, that our investment, households investment to buy stocks or financial assets are not considered as investment, and therefore, it is not included in that GDP. What about government purchase? G. So, G includes all spending on goods and services purchased by governments and at all level, federal, state and local, because at the state level also what the state government are spending, that is also, that money is coming from, a part of that money is coming from that central government. So, that is why spending at all level, federal, state and local, are considered as government purchases. But this G does not include any transfer payment. For example, any social security or unemployment insurance, okay, that are not considered as purchase. Sometimes in the Indian context, government do give some kind of transfer payments to the, let us say, elderly, some kind of money they give to elderly people or widows. Those things in abroad, in foreign, many of the foreign countries, in the UK and in UK and the US, they have social security or unemployment insurance benefits. Those things are not that much there in Indian context, but it is there in some of the developed countries, but those are known as transfer payment. It is just government spending on those individuals, it is not adding any value. That is why it is not included in GDP. Okay. Any transfer or gifts which is coming from government to the individual, or if a particular country receives some kind of aid from foreign countries, that is also not included in government's GDP. So, they are not actually purchase of goods and services, that is why not included. Then net export, it is export minus import. So, that is the why it is included. I already explained that export represent foreign spending on economies, goods and services, and import represent the domestic spending on foreign goods and services. Okay. So, that is why adding all the components we get C plus I plus G plus this net export. All right. Now, this is some kind of figures in the context of US in the year 2007. Y is $13,841 billion, and out of which you have C is this much, I is this much, and net export is negative. What does it mean? That means the United States imported more than actually it could export. So, if you add all those figures, you will get 13,841. And as a percentage, 70% is from consumption, 15% is from investment, 19% from government spending, and this is some 5.1%. So, most significant component of GDP is then the consumption expenditure. Okay. And this is per capita. So, if you divide by number of people or number of citizens, then you will get per capita income. So, this is some kind of active learning, GDP and its component. You can take these questions For example, in each of the following cases, determine how much GDP and each of its component is affected. Okay. So, a person Devi spends $200 to buy her husband's dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston, one of the finest city in the United States, right. And then Sarah spends $1,800 on a new laptop to use in her publishing house. The laptop was built in China, right. And Jane spends $1,200 on a computer to use in her editing business. She got last year's model on sale for a great price from local manufacturer. These are all three nice examples to understand which one should be included in GDP and as a component of what. GDP has C plus I plus G plus net exports. Now, we have to understand these three. Debbie spends $200, what will happen, right. And this is another last example. General Motors builds $500 million worth of cars, but consumers only buy 470 million worth of them. Okay, what will happen to the remaining? So, now let us see the first one. When Debbie spends 200 to buy husband's dinner at the finest restaurant in Boston. So, what happened? Consumption basically increases by $200, and since the consumption is a part of GDP, so this is very simple. When I am spending for dinner, that is basically my consumption expenditure. GDP also increases by 200. Sarah spends $1,800 on a new laptop to use in her publishing business, but the laptop was not produced in the United States, it was built in China. What will happen? Investment rises by 1,800, but net export falls by 1,800. GDP is unchanged. This is very important. Why first of all this 1,800 is gone investment? Because that laptop will be used in the publishing business and that will generate future income. That is why this is kind of, you can think of, this is a capital purchase. You are buying an equipment, you are not consuming it immediately. So, that is why this is investment. But I am importing from China. So, that means my net export x minus m is falling by $1,800. So, at the one hand I is going up by 1,800, NX component is falling by 1,800, GDP is unchanged. Then the third one, Jane spends $1,200 on a computer to use in her editing business. She got last year's model on sale for a great price from a local manufacturer. Current GDP and investment do not change because the computer was built last year only. Okay. So, what I said, GDP includes the market value of the current product. Okay. Since this is built in last year, that means this value would have already been included in last year's GDP. If you add again in this year, then there would be double counting. So, whenever there is a sale, whenever you are spending on sales, that means those things are old items. So, any expenditure on old items will not be included in current GDP and investment. Otherwise, we would have included that in investment, because that is also like the previous case. You are using that laptop or computer in editing business. Just because it was built last year, we are not including it in this year's GDP calculation. And General Motor builds 500 million worth of cars, but consumers buy only 470. Then what will happen? Consumption rises by 470 and inventory investment also rises by 30 and GDP rises 500. So, even though the entire amount is not consumed, that means consumption and inventory both are rising, and as a result of which, that means C and inventory is there in that investment, both are rising and GDP is also rising by $500. Okay. So, these are 4 fantastic examples to understand how different type of consumption actually enters into our GDP value. Then there is a question of real versus nominal GDP. Now, you might be able to recall in one of our previous discussion we are mentioning about inflation. When government prints too much of money, that leads to inflation. So, inflation is basically to increase in economy's general price level. Now, when the general price level goes up, then your income will have less purchasing power. That is why we said that when we earn 1 lakh, that is only our nominal income. And if we divide that nominal income by inflation, that means general price level, then we will get real income, because that is how that real income will show you how much you would be able to buy in terms of goods and services. So, that is the reason there are 2 measures of GDP or income. Inflation can distort economic variables like GDP. So, we have 2 versions of GDP. One is corrected for inflation, which is real GDP, and nominal is not corrected for inflation, that is why it is nominal. Okay. So, nominal values of output using the current prices, it is not corrected for inflation. Okay. And real GDP value is the output using the prices of a base year. What is base year? I will talk on that with some example. Real GDP is corrected for inflation. Now, one example will make things more clear. Let us say that in an economy there are 2 commodities produced, pizza and latte. 2005, 6, 7, these are the 3 years. In 2005, pizza price was 10, in 2006 it was 11, 2007 it was 12, and the quantity of pizza produced was 400, 500 and 600. Latte price was 2, 2.5 and $3 respectively, and these are the quantity. Now, if you add this 10 into 400 plus 2 into 1000, then you will get 2005's GDP in 2005's value price. So, that is why that is called nominal GDP in 2005. So, you compute the GDP in each year, it is very simple. In 2005 it is $6,000, 2006 it is $8,250 and it is $10,800. Now, GDP is increasing, but the question is GDP is increasing in real terms? That means whether country is able to produce more pizza and latte, or is it because the price of pizza and latte going on, okay, increasing. So, that is why now let us consider that 2005 as the base year, then what will happen? Okay. So, from 2005 to 2006 there is an increase in 37.5%, and look at here, from 2006 to 7 there is an increase in 30.9% in terms of value. So, now can you compute the real GDP in each year using 2005 as the base year? That means, instead of multiplying each year's quantity with that year's price, we will multiply by 2005's price. Okay, 2005 as the base year we are considering. So, 2005 it was $6,000, that is fine. In 2006 what will happen? 500 into 10. Now, instead of multiplying with 11, I am multiplying with base year's value. And look at this, in 2007 it is 8,400, because again I am multiplying with 2005. So, this is basically then I am considering the real change, because price I have kept constant at 2005, right. Now, you see there is increase only 20%, and then this is only 16.7%, and rest is because of inflation, increase in price. So, now we can easily calculate the nominal and real GDP. Nominal is 6,000, in base year both real and nominal are same, but in 2006 the nominal is 8,250, but real is only 7,200, likewise in 2007. So, in each year what is happening then? Nominal GDP is measured using the current prices, and real GDP is measured using the base year, which is 2005 in this particular example. Okay. So, nominal GDP increased by 37.5, but real GDP increased by only 20%. The change in nominal GDP reflects both prices and quantities. That is very important. So, this 37.5% increase in GDP, actually it has two components, increase in real value as well as increase in price. But the change in real GDP, okay, it indicates change in value as if the inflation is 0. Okay. So, that is why the change in real GDP is the amount that GDP would change if price were constant. Hence, real GDP is corrected for inflation. That is what we wanted to say. Okay. Now, nominal and real GDP, if you plot, let us say from 1965 to 2007, you see real GDP is increasing, nominal GDP is also increasing, then after some point of time nominal GDP is increasing more than the real. So, that means there is inflation is going on, right. So, then from there we can get a measure of GDP deflator, is a measure of the overall level of price. What is GDP deflator then? GDP deflator is basically nominal GDP divided by real GDP multiplied by 100. So, this GDP deflator is also considered as a measure of inflation itself. When we will be talking about inflation, we will come back to this point once again. Inflation is a sustained rise in general price level, That is why a GDP means what? A general price level only, because GDP includes everything. That is why if you take a ratio of nominal and real GDP and then multiply by 100, you will get a GDP deflator. So, one way to measure economic inflation is to compute the increase in GDP deflator. Okay. First you calculate GDP deflator, and then from 1 year GDP deflator to next year GDP deflator, you will get the inflation. With the same example you can understand. So, GDP deflator in each year we can calculate just nominal by real. Okay. And then how much percentage change it is happening in the GDP deflator? Look at this, 14%, and this is 2006 to 7, it is 12.2%. So, we will first calculate GDP deflator and then we will find out the percentage change in GDP deflator, and that will be considered as inflation. Very simple. Now, with this example also we can solve the following problems. Nominal GDP in 2007, which you can easily calculate, and then you can also calculate real GDP in 2008, just divide by nominal by real. So, that will be considered as real GDP. And then you can also compute the GDP deflator, which is nominal versus divided by real, that is GDP deflator. Okay. So, real GDP how will you find? So, the moment you want to constitute real GDP, that means you have to multiply that year's value with the base year's price. If you consider base year is 2007, you have to multiply with that year's price, that is the case. So, nominal GDP is again very simple, price into quantity, and real GDP in 2008, that means we have to multiply the price of 2007. Okay. So, 1000 instead of multiplying $31, I am multiplying with $30, that is all. And GDP deflator in 2009, nominal versus real. So, this is nominal GDP, and you have to find out the real GDP and then take the ratio and multiply by 100, you will get GDP deflator. Okay. So, GDP and economic well-being, that is one important thing. So far we were talking about GDP. What was the reason? Because we are saying the GDP is nation's income, that means more the GDP value, more would be the well-being. But does it really happen in reality? Actually, and the answer is no. GDP is not always associated with economic well-being of the individuals. Why this is so? See, real GDP per capita is the main indicator of the average person's standard of living, but GDP is not a perfect measure of well-being. Why this is so? There are many reasons. That is why Robert Kennedy issued a very eloquent yet harsh criticism of GDP. Look at what Kennedy said long back. It does not allow for the health of our children, the quality of their education, or the joy of their play. One simple example I am giving, one shortcoming. GDP, as we have discussed, it is measured by the expenditure. Suppose our children are not feeling well, they are having bad health due to pollution. I go to doctor and I spend money. That expenditure will be treated as GDP value. So, that means if more people are having ill health, that is actually causing your GDP to increase. So, that means higher GDP is not reflecting a better health of our children, rather poor health will lead to more GDP. More pollution means more pollution averting expenditure and more the GDP. Okay. So, if there are more cyclists in the economy, then there would be less GDP, because they are not buying cars, they are not making pollutions, nobody is dying with pollution, nobody is having averting expenditure of any pollution. All those activities will be stopped if we all started cycling or even walking. So, that is why GDP, even though it is a measure of nation's income, that does not always reflect country's well-being. Okay. That is what Kennedy said. It does not include the beauty of our poetry or the strength of our marriages, the intelligence of our public debate or the integrity of our public officials. It measures neither our courage nor our wisdom nor our devotion to our country. So, anyway, this is in a classic literary sense. We will come back to more criticism of this GDP as cited by the economists. Look at this. GDP does not value many things. The quality of environment is not included. Rather, poor the quality of environment, as I said, better would be the abatement expenditure, more would be the GDP. It does not include the leisure time, the value of time, quality time that we spend in our family. Non-market activities, the child care the parents provides for his or her children, that is also not valued in GDP. An equitable distribution of income. GDP assumes that if there is $100 income and there are 10 individuals, then per capita GDP is $10. But wealth, it has a natural tendency to be accumulated in the hands of a few. That means a mere increase in GDP does not mean that everybody is getting $10 and the everybody's well-being is going up. No, this GDP will create a lot of inequality in the system, okay, which the standard measure of GDP does not talk about. But then why do we care about GDP? Interestingly, many of the indicators of well-being are positively associated with GDP. That is why. Having a large GDP enables a country to afford better schools, cleaner environment, health care. So, many indicators of the quality of life are actually positively correlated with GDP. For example, if you look at GDP and life expectancy in 12 countries, you will see that if you go real GDP in the United States and Japan, life expectancy is much higher. But countries like Nigeria, Bangladesh, India, with having relatively lower per capita GDP, is actually having lower life expectancy. So, that is one indicator of well-being. Okay. Then you see GDP and literacy rate, that is also positive correlation, adult literacy and GDP. If you see this graph, countries with higher level of income is having higher literacy rate. Then you see internet uses and GDP, that is also much higher with advanced countries. You look at the countries like Pakistan, Nigeria, China, India, their internet use is within 20%, whereas countries like Japan and US, they are using 70%. So, what we have learned then in this chapter? Gross domestic product measures a country's total income and expenditure. The four components of GDP include consumption, investment, government purchase and net exports. And nominal GDP is measured using current prices, real GDP is measured using the prices of a base year, assuming zero inflation. Gross domestic product is a measure of countries, this we have already included. GDP is the main indicator of a country's economic well-being, even though it is not perfect. Just now we have discussed that we are considering GDP because many of the well-being indicators are positively correlated with GDP. With this, we are closing our discussion today. This is the first chapter in our macroeconomics. We were talking about the first macroeconomic principles, basically GDP, that a country's well-being depends on country's income. That is where we are interested to know about GDP and its measurement, but we have also discussed that GDP, it has several flaws. Higher GDP does not always reflect higher well-being. With this, I am closing my discussion. Thank you.